I've been on tour for 50 days, and I've been at 120 events, and I don't think I've ever seen a crowd so punctual. so well done. I'm a punctual person too, so I like it. Okay, so I got involved in this, as was just discussed, through 2012 and this smoke-free edition, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And I do have a history background. My undergraduate degree is in history, and my postgraduate work was in arts. So I came to this project as a lover of Christmas, but also of history and art. And what I found in researching this was not only the amazing history of it, but the art legacy, which is outstanding. And since we're in a museum with many great works of art, it's kind of appropriate that I'll dwell on the art today. That's my plan. So Clement Moore, let's start here. Clement Moore is considered the poet of Christmas Eve. He was born in Chelsea, Manhattan in 1779 and dies in Rhode Island in 1863. So a very interesting period of time, American Revolution through the American Civil War. And he graduates from Columbia University and is a very well-educated man. He speaks multiple languages, including Hebrew, and he publishes and writes the first Hebrew lexicon in this country, the first Hebrew dictionary. He also is credited with bringing opera to New York, Italian opera, and he played multiple instruments. But he also was a father of children. At the time he wrote the poem, he had 6 children. He goes on to have 9. And I always like to share with you the story of Twas for Christmas and how it all started. It was a Christmas Eve, 1822, in Chelsea, New York, and Clement Moore was standing in his parlor, and his wife said, "We're making up charity baskets for the neighborhood, and I'm short a turkey. I put a turkey into my baskets. Can you run into Greenwich Village on your sleigh and grab me a turkey?" And so he says, "Of course I can." So he takes his driver and his horses and his sleigh, and he dashes off into the snowy Christmas Eve. We checked the weather reports, it was snowing. And he gets the turkey, and he comes back, and he's struck by the magic of the evening, and the jingle bells, and the snow, and it's Christmas Eve, and he writes his poem. And he comes in the door of his home, gives his wife the turkey, and then he goes upstairs and writes it on his desk and comes down and delivers it to his children and his mother, all 6 of the children. And that's the story. We have no factual basis to back any of it up with. It's a lovely story. It's highly probable, but we don't have anything to go on really. It's been the story that's been carried on for decades and decades. We have little bits of information about it. We have Clement Moore, of course, saying he wrote it, and he said that he wrote it for his children. He said that he was inspired by an individual on his father's property to do it. And in all likelihood, he heard some of the lines from other people in this day and age. Often oral traditions was the way people heard stories. And then these people started, people like Clement Moore started to write them down and add to them. So Robbie Burns does this. All kinds of them do it. And Clement Moore, I think, was inspired by probably hearing this poem, at least in part, from people in his past when he was a child. However, he does take credit to it, and rightly so. He claims he wrote it. He writes out 5 copies of it, and he signs his name to them. And they're worth between $500,000 and $750,000 each. There's 5 of them. We know where 4 of them are. So, should you ever come across a 5th one, it's worth a lot of money. The interesting thing about Moore is that the poem is published anonymously in the Troy Sentinel, and it is published in 1823, hence the 200th anniversary this year. But he doesn't take claim to it till 1837. And the reason for this is that this is a gentleman who graduated from Columbia, valedictorian of his class in theology, Oriental, and classical studies. He teaches at the General Theological Seminary. He's a very serious scholastic, academic. And he wrote it for his children. He didn't write it to be published. And so when he does find out that it has been published, and his mother and his children sort of encourage him to come forward and claim it in 1837, and Charles Hoffman, who puts it in the New York Book of Poetry, he says, "Okay, all right, I'll claim it as mine," and he does. But some people say, because he was so academic, that it's hard to believe he ever wrote this poem. And that's one of the arguments they use to try and attack his authorship, which has been a subject of conversation for well, let's see, started 60 years after the poem was published, so from 1880 until now, with people sort of challenging this authorship. But the fact that he was a father and a very loving father and grandfather, it's completely possible and plausible this man wrote this for his children. Lots of people did great academic works and still wrote for the children. Robert Southey, the poet laureate, very famous poet, wrote Three Bears and Goldilocks. So, it's completely possible these men wrote for their children. This is this graduating class in Columbia of 1798. And the population of New York City at that time was 164,000 people. So it kind of puts it into perspective. This is Clement C. Moore's wife. Her name is Catherine Elizabeth Taylor Moore. She was quite a bit his junior, but very much in love with each other. They wrote love poetry to each other, and we have those poems. They have 9 children, but very sadly she dies at the age of 32. And he's left to raise the children by himself. He never remarries, and he stays in his home in Chelsea. This is the house in Chelsea, and his grandfather was Thomas Clarke. Thomas Clarke, on his mother's side, comes to America in 1750, and he buys up a great deal of land, which he calls Chelsea. And so Chelsea, New York, is named after by Thomas Clarke. And the Moores go on to own it all through Clement C. Moore's life. The house comes down in the 1850s. It's torn down and thrown into the Hudson River. They didn't know about, I think, environmental practices. They won't throw houses in rivers, but they did then. But that's where the name comes from. The grandfather was a retired major in the British Army, and he names it Chelsea after Chelsea Veterans Hospital in London. So very wealthy family, as you can imagine. This property was used by George Washington's troops as well as by the British during the American Revolution at different times. And what's really interesting is that when Alexander Hamilton is lying dying after the duel, a horse comes galloping up to his house to grab Benjamin Moore, Bishop Benjamin Moore, Clement C. Moore's father, and he gives the last rites to Alexander Hamilton. The other side of Moore's family are the Moores. And so you've got the Clarks and the Moores. This is his paternal family side. This is in Elmhurst, and this is where the Elmhurst subway station is. They came in 1630, and they owned all the land here and lots of acreage around it. They developed Newton Apples, and they also did land development, including in Saratoga Springs. So again, very wealthy family. And the Moores, Clement C. Moore goes on to be a man who never needed to work a day of his life. However, he certainly did work hard at the General Theological Seminary. And he also had a great sort of passion for helping others, and he worked with the blind, and he also worked with special education. Those were two of his big focuses, along with all his other incredible pursuits. He was also on the Board of Trustees of Columbia for 30 years, so pretty amazing man. I was researching more, and I couldn't find very much. It's really unfortunate. There's a couple of biographies, but they're poorly written, and they're not footnoted, so you can't really go on things that don't have good references. You don't know true or not. So you have to really look into the archives. This is at Columbia University at the archives, and I found his diaries, and it's really sad because he writes in the first page of his diary, a diary which ought to have begun at least 60 years ago, Clement C. Moore, 5 years before he dies, right? So had he written more, we'd know a lot more about him. Philip Hone, the ex-mayor of New York, wrote incredible diaries, and we know a lot about the city because of diaries such as that. Clement C. Moore, not the case. But I was able to piece together his life, and particularly the character of the man. He was very, very generous. Yes, he was wealthy, but he was very generous, and loved by everybody, and extremely well educated. So, as I said, he wrote the poem out 4 times, 5 times, we think, in hand. So let's leave the Moors. Let's go back to the Roman Empire. So it all starts here in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, wonderful painting. And St. Nicholas learns of these 2 women who are going to be sold into slavery because they don't have money. Their father doesn't have the money to buy them into marriage. So back in that day, you had to have money, dowry, or you wouldn't be married. And so the father's poor, can't keep the girls, can't feed them. And so Nicholas hears this story, this saga, and he comes one night and he throws gold balls through the window to rescue these women. And the father stays up the second night and discovers what's going on, and he confronts Nicholas and says, "Thank you so much." And Nicholas says, No, I'm doing this because I don't want gratitude, I don't want thanks, I just wanted to help you. So this is where Santa Claus, this whole St. Nick Santa Claus comes from, is this concept of anonymous giving at night and generosity of spirit, which is very much part of our season, and also our looking out for people this time of the year who are in need. And sometimes we forget to look at our neighbors or people who don't have all that we have and share. So this is where it really comes from. I find this fascinating as a cultural historian to be able to draw threads through centuries like this and make connections. The Romans also decorated their houses with greenery at Christmas, at winter Saturnalia time, and they also gave presents to each other. They did all kinds of other things, including Saturnalia, this wild festivities, but they certainly try to make sense of long winter nights and things, just like the Nordics did. So it's fascinating to see how Christmas develops. In my book, I go into this in a much, much more detailed way. One of the interesting things I'll just mention, which I sometimes forget to say, is that when the Twin Towers were blown up on 9/11, they also blew up St. Nicholas Church in Manhattan. And when it was the memorial was built, the Greek Orthodox Church brought the relic of the right hand of St. Nicholas to the memorial at the World Center. So it's there now, which is really interesting that they did that. I think it's just this connectivity again that I find so amazing. So let's go back to the era of Moore. So 1810, this is John Petard, and in Manhattan in New York, celebrations at this time of the year, winter, Christmas Eve time through New Year's, was a very rowdy time. Very violent, lots of drinking, lots of guns, lots of murder. There's lots of things going on in the city. And these people, especially Petard, was really upset about it. He wanted to calm this whole thing down. He wanted to make it about family. He and his daughter had been home one night, and some revelers had come in. And back in this time, you weren't a Christmas caroler singing a song and looking for a piece of fruitcake. You came in, and you took what you wanted, and you stayed as long as you wanted to. And it scared he and his daughter quite badly. And so he decided, he had the idea, let's make St. Nicholas the patron saint of America. And if not that, let's make him patron saint of New York. And so he sets about this. He's a very industrious individual. His biography is absolutely fascinating to read. You can get it on Wikipedia or anywhere. John Petard, totally fascinating individual. He usually he got what he set out to do. So the New York Historical Society had been recently started, and this was where they thought they'd get this idea going, and they started a festival of St. Nicholas at dinner. And what's really interesting is that the great Washington Irving, the American author, novelist, comes to the idea in 1809 with Knickerbocker, The History of the World. So he writes this wonderful book and includes St. Nicholas 25 times, and we have to credit Washington Irving with being the first person to put St. Nicholas in a wagon flying around the skies in Manhattan, right? And Washington Irving, I was at Sunnyside yesterday speaking, and his home up in Tarrytown, and Washington Irving was the most amazing individual, extremely funny. He wrote lots about Christmas, and he went to Scotland to meet Sir Walter Scott, and Sir Walter Scott encouraged him a lot in German folk tales and things, and to learn German. And this is the author of Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow. Right? So this is, and that's where he was inspired by Sir Walter Scott. What's really interesting about Washington Irving is that Washington Irving wrote in Sagamonde and his Christmas stories, Old Christmas, he writes primarily about Christmas dinner and the banquet and things. But what he does is he encourages Charles Dickens. And if you read Pickwick Papers and Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, written in 1843, much later than all of this, 20 years later, and then you read Washington Irving, the parallel and the inspiration that he drew from Washington Irving has to be acknowledged. This is the man who we have to credit a great deal of Christmas to in America, not Charles Dickens, in my humble opinion. So he was the first internationally known American novelist. Very, very famous and loved. Here's his Knickerbocker character. He coined Knickerbocker, right? So we got St. Nick flying around the skies with Washington Irving. So how do we get the reindeer, right? How does the reindeer come up? Well, this is Hogarth, and even the Romans knew that reindeer were used for sleighing, and they knew they were used for milking. They drank reindeer milk. And the Romans documented this. So the Romans didn't do it, the northern communities do, but the Romans understood this from their travels and documented it. But in 1821, the year before Twas was written by Clement Moore, a little poem comes out called The Children's Friend. And we don't know who wrote it, but it has a bishop character in a sleigh full of books, and it's drawn by one reindeer. So there we have the first reindeer, which is really fascinating. But he also comes along with a birchen rod in the back of his sleigh, which is a stick that was used to beat upon naughty children. So that is, I'll come to this in a minute, it's a very important point. But the other person that I don't have a picture of, which I should, but is James Fenimore Cooper comes along right here too in 1822, and he writes a book called The Pioneers. And in The Pioneers, he describes the judge driving home on his sleigh on Christmas Eve, and he says to his drivers, we're going home tonight in time for Santa Claus. Oh, no. And it is the first time we've ever seen the word Santa Claus spelled like that in the English language. So James Fenimore Cooper has to be acknowledged. Both Washington Irving, Sir Walter Scott, and James Fenimore Cooper all talk about horses called Thunder and Blitzen. But how the other reindeer got their names, we don't know. This is in my book that I published. These are the reindeer that we created, and there's 8 of them. So Clement Moore needs to be credited with 3 major things. 1, 8 reindeer, because it's wonderfully fun and the names are great. Turning St. Nick into an elf, which he does. Takes him out of the religious sector into the secular. And there is no birchen rod. Fundamentally, huge difference in this poem and other works of the time. There was no threat of anybody being caught out for naughty or nice. There's nobody's going to be, dealt with. It's benevolent and kind. And I think it comes very much from Moore's orientation as a theologian, who was trained as one and ordained, that it is non-judgmental, it is kind, loving, fun, merry, creative, and it's got nothing to do with dreading anything. And it even says nothing to dread in the lines of the poem. And it's not a message poem, it's a fun poem for children, and that's why it's been loved for 200 years. It's just jolly and great, and children gravitate to it because it is so lovely, right, and loving. So, it comes from the Moore home in 1823 to the Troy Sentinel newspaper. The Troy Sentinel newspaper the editor is Orville Hawley. Orville Hawley is a Harvard graduate lawyer, and he's very well known, and he writes a wonderful preface to it that precedes the poem in the print. And so when it goes to press on October 23rd of 1823, without an illustration or anything else, just on page 3, it's picked up by other papers who follow his editing and his papers, and it's printed immediately in other papers into January, and then it follows into the next year, the almanacs, and then it becomes known as the annual Christmas poem. Like, it just takes off like wildfire because it's really fun, right? We all love it. So the illustrators come to it, but they don't come to it early. They wait. 1830 is the first illustration in the Troy Sentinel in a broadsheet, but this is 1841, and it's always been fun to see how illustrators come to it with their own interpretation. They have big pipes, little pipes. They have elfy people. They have father figures. It's absolutely fascinating. And the poem, the way it's written, lends itself to be illustrated, really quite broadly. Santa can be different races. He can be an elf. He can be, whatever you really want him to be. He can be Mickey Mouse, like Disney did. You can do whatever you want. This is something I just found. I put it here because I find it kind of comical. The poem was first called An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas. It quickly changes to Twas the Night Before Christmas, The Night Before Christmas, and a whole bunch of variations of that. I found this in the Smithsonian, and it is called Christmas Carol, which is 1843, the same year that Christmas Carol came out. So somebody got really confused, and they thought that this was the Christmas Carol. They didn't understand. So that's the only time I've ever seen it called Christmas Carol, but in the exact same year as Christmas Carol comes out. So, as I was saying, this whole concept of a happier or a more sane Christmas, a family Christmas, this inside-outside conflict that was going on. This is 1858. This is Winslow Homer, and it's still this sort of indoor-outdoor situation. Still lots of revelry, lots of misrule on the streets. still 12th night at some level, but this Christmas is developing in the home, mainly because of the poem. 1862 comes along, and the great F.O.C. Doherty does this wonderful edition. It's all hand done, hand painted, hand tinted, no color printing yet. And this is the one that Theodore Roosevelt read when he was 4 years of age and read to his children and his grandchildren. And this edition is in Sagamore Hill Presidential Library on Long Island. This is the Doherty edition at Doherty House. 1863, the following year, comes along Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is an incredibly talented individual as well. This is the first Santa Claus he ever paints, and it's during the American Civil War, and he's definitely on the side of the North, and he's made Santa Claus a patriot. So these renderings are accompanied by incredibly politicized editorial, and they wrap the poem up into this whole situation on both sides of the conflict. And a lot of them I put in my book because they're fascinating to read how they took this poem and used it for political ideas. What Nast also does, which is totally fascinating for me, is that he comes back and in his illustrations and his interpretation of this whole, Christmas Eve thing with Santa, he puts naughty and nice back into it. Mm-hmm. He puts the spyglass, he puts the lists of who's naughty or nice, he brings it all back in. This is his own little boy, he painted him often, but, and today we have naughty or nice all over the place. You got on t-shirts, you got on music, and you just sort of stop and wonder what that's all about, because I think children just should be enjoyed this time of year. I don't think anybody should be keeping track of anybody's behavior. I think that they should get a pass at Christmas time, like Clement Moore, right? I just think everybody, or be a little bit more self-regulated. I was with a Santa Claus the other day, and he said he had a little boy on his lap, and he said, have you been a naughty or good or naughty or nice? And the little boy had a freak out, and he looked at his mother and said, I don't know, like, what do you think? And I thought, maybe we should maybe put that to rest for a while. But maybe we can just go back to just, let's just be kind. Nobody needs to sit in the corner. So what happens, Louis Prang comes into America from Germany. So Thomas Nast is German as well. Louis Prang comes from Germany with printing presses, and he can now print color. This is his Twas. And he does wonderful Christmas cards, Twas Meant for Christmas in a wonderful edition, and reproductions of art. I put him on the back cover of my book because I credit this man with democratizing art in America, because he could take paintings like this and reproduce them for people's homes, and it changed interior design. But up to then, they had to have originals or, I guess, local or family art or their own creations, I guess. Kind of nice to have this, in a reproduction instead of something by, Aunt Nellie. So you see what happens to Twas, right? It goes full color and goes crazy. Everybody starts illustrating it in these wonderful editions. And by the end of the century, you've got the red suit arriving in 1880. And then you have Ellen Klapsel bringing a very happy Santa to the whole mix. She was a very, very famous Christmas card designer. And there's 500 million cards in circulation of 3,000 per design. So, that's an incredible amount of production. It's a very sad story, but we won't get into that right now. She ends up being so successful in America that she gets set up by a couple of the Wolf brothers and her own money from Litchfield, New York, and she goes over to Germany to set up printing presses, and then World War I comes along and blows everything up. And her life goes in a very spiral mental health crisis after that. Very sad. 1902 comes along, turn century. We get Denslow. Denslow is famous for Wizard of Oz. And he does Twas, and it's a wonderful edition. It's worth a couple $100. It's not a lot compared to some of them. I think it should be worth more, but hey, I have a couple in my collection. Then you get 1912, 10 years later, Jessie Wilcox Smith. Jessie Wilcox Smith is an incredibly talented illustrator as well, and her works are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars now, as are original illustrations. This is her cover of Twas, and she did the cover of every issue of Good Housekeeping magazine for 30 years. So she was well known and very wealthy. Here's Jessie Wilcox Smith. It was acceptable to be an artist and an illustrator at this time for women. I find that really interesting, and it was one of the discoveries of my work on this book was how many of them were in the arts, in illustration and book arts. Editors, book designers, illustrators, and they all came, a lot of them came up through the School of Howard Pyle at the Drexel in Delaware. So whenever you're working on a book like mine, you come across things that you didn't go looking for and that you didn't know that you'd find. But this is a really interesting story. It's one of the big finds, I guess, of my research, was the story of the Odells. The oldest copy of this poem is in the handwriting of this young woman, Mary Odell, and it's 1824 watermark paper. Clement Moore's copies are 1850 to 1860. So he waited a long time to handwrite, or at least those are the only ones we have. And I don't think there's early editions. Maybe the very first ones, of course, but they've been lost to time. This young woman was a daughter of Jonathan Odell. Jonathan Odell is Clement Moore's godfather. He was also an American surgeon, clergyman, and spy. And he spied for the British. And during the American Civil War, Revolution, he was the one that decoded all the papers between Benedict Arnold and Andre during the defection affair. And this is a letter from George Washington I found in the Smithsonian that says that Jonathan Odell can walk about and do whatever he wants without being molested or disturbing him for his lifetime. George Washington didn't know who he was, which is really interesting. And these phony papers kind of thing is another James Fenimore Cooper book called The Spy. So back in the day, unlike our own generation, you can't sort of verify someone's identity. It was really difficult and probably quite easy to forge George Washington's signature. This is the other really interesting find, was the Constable family in upstate New York. They claim the poem was written here or inspired by this house. This is the cousin of Clement Moore. The house is 1819, and there's a real story to this. His chest set's there. Yes, the family had relations, like that went back and forth and visited one another, but it's highly unlikely that this is where he wrote the poem. And again, it's just these stories that get created. One of the interesting things about this too is that a man, I was up there one day doing some work, and a man called and said he had the desk that Clement Moore wrote the poem on. My eyebrows kind of went up, going, okay, well, we know where there's four of them, so there's a desk. There's a desk in the New York Historical Society that has a plaque saying it's a desk that Clement Moore wrote the poem on. And there's one at the National Christmas Center in Pennsylvania, and there's one in Newport, Rhode Island, in the Newport Historical Museum. And then there's this man's a bit here, and yet we don't know if he even wrote it on the desk. So, which desk? I have no idea. But that's just the fun, and it's okay to have magical thinking. This is a very dreamy place, and when you go there, because the house is the right year, and you walk in the parlor, you get a sense of it. And he may have been in the room. He may have. Certainly his cousin lived there. It's possible. And it's lovely sort of to romanticize, but it's not factually correct so far. So just coming back to illustration, this is Thomas Nast. This is called The Portrait of St. Nick or Santa Claus. This is very, very famous painting. And look at the long pipe, right? It's not at all like described in the story. But this was very popular in the 80s and 90s. This was on everything from shower curtains to sheets. Just prolific. I'm sure many of you have seen it. Here's the very first Red Santa Claus, 1880. Has nothing to do with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola comes along much later and does, in my opinion, can be credited with giving this character, the most influential character ever created in English fiction, an enormous PR campaign that took him around the world. It's been translated into every single major language, including Yiddish. But that's Coca-Cola, that's about it. Yeah. And maybe, personifying more the father figure than had been done before in a big way. This is a little book I published. It's printed in 1922 originally, and it's the story of Santa Claus as a little boy growing up in Pudding Lane. And it's a wonderful little story, and I found it, and so I thought, I'm going to redo this book. So I redid the cover, and we redesigned the whole thing. And it's the story of how he wants to be a giver without being paid, and his grandmother, Mother Goose, comes to his rescue. And so I was really intrigued by Mother Goose. Like, what's Mother Goose got to do with Santa Claus, right? But I discovered that Thomas Nast also had Mother Goose painted with Santa Claus. And so there's sort of 100 years of Mother Goose being involved. And then I looked a little further, and I discovered that before the days of Dickens sort of taking over, his Christmas Carol and all these theatrical productions, Mother Goose pantomimes were the #1 thing for children to attend in London at Christmas time. So Mother Goose has had a big part of Christmas, and we've lost this since 1922. I don't think very many of you know that Mother Goose is his grandmother. So this is my book. I published it for the bicentennial, the 200th year. I also published it in 2012, as we said. It did cause a lot of static. Stephen Colbert did a spoof on me, and that kind of started the whole thing going. And Barbara Walters on The View, and then it kind of kicked off. And I did it because I was trying to work with Stanton Glantz at the University of California, Southern California, on smoke-free movies. We just, that idea just come up, that maybe we should put disclaimers in movies and have smoking. And we were laughed at by a lot of politicians about that idea. But today, it's really rewarding whenever I see a film that says smoke-free movies. At that time, I wanted to do something that I was publishing, and I realized that Santa Claus smoked. And so I took the pipe out, and it went kind of crazy, I must say. I was called a literary vandal on NPR. I was hit on the head with a book called The Heretic. I got hate mail from elves. Yeah, it was crazy. But I stand behind it because in 1998, the Bill Clinton administration of the White House killed Joe Camel, and they did it for a reason, because they had science that showed that cartoon characters depicted as smoking sympathize with children towards smoking later in life. And I did it because I'm a child's rights activist, and I wanted little kids to have the option of not bumping into a smoking Santa, especially children whose parents smoke and who worry about their parents, and also worry about Santa Claus. And they will actually write letters to Santa Claus saying, please help us, help get our parents to quit. I'll go without Christmas presents. We did a survey of 1,000 children, and we were hearing things like that. And so I thought, here's the last character in the world and the last book in the world that little children need to, go to and then turn a page and go, oh, he smokes, great. There goes that wish, right? So I did it for that reason. I completely stand behind what I did, and I still get a bit of slack. But the poem has been done in every possible version you can imagine. It's been done the Pirates. It's been done Twas the Night Before Christmas under the sea. There's a guinea pig version of This Christmas. There's, Mickey Mouse. I mean, there's every version you can think of. And so, to edit this, and it's been edited by so many people. I mean, even the line at the end, Happy Christmas, right? Somebody decided early on, no, we do Happy New Year's, so let's do Merry Christmas. So that's an edit. I mean, that's changing what the author originally did. But for some reason, the smoking really excited certain people, which is fine, I get it. So if you're looking for some really fun ones to view, I particularly like this one by King Charles, was Prince Charles, this is 2020. He does it with Camilla and Judy Dent and Maggie Smith, and it's a really fun one. You can find it on YouTube, and there's all kinds of other ones. There's theatrical productions, there's ballet Twas, there's Cirque du Soleil Twas, there's musical, there's film, there's 2 silent films from the late 1800s that are very great to watch. You can get all of this on YouTube. Louis Armstrong's is a fun one. There's everybody. Perry Como. There's so many people. And then going forward, there's lots of people as well. So Keith Morrison apparently is a really great one. So it's been done, and it's been read at the White House every year since 1953 by the First Lady, and many governors and the homes, they read it to the public too. This year, last year I started out actually, but this year I went out to try and get some real interest in this poem, and I went to Washington, D.C. in August, and I was at the National Book Festival with the Library of Congress, and we made a pitch to the Library of Congress to do something at the White House, to do something bigger, to celebrate this very famous poem that's considered the most famous poem ever written. And the White House went full on. I mean, they have reindeer flying across the ceilings in the White House right now. And the First Lady, Jill Biden, put out a media release on November 28th explaining all that she'd done, and why she'd done it, and why this important poem needs to be remembered and read this year. So that was really delightful. The Mayor of New York also declared December 23rd Twas the Night Before Christmas night. When I was at Columbia University speaking a couple weeks ago, that was really great. And I nominated Clement Moore into the New York State Library Hall of Fame, and they accepted my nomination, and we're doing that on Tuesday night in Manhattan at a party of 300 people. So with about 30 more coming, which I went in to try to find one more, because I didn't want to be receiving the award, because I had no right to get this award, and we didn't know who to give it to. So I was tasked with finding more. And so I found one. I found Clement Clarke Moore. I think he's the 10th. He's on the board of the Morgan, and I found him because he loaned a Rembrandt to somebody. But I did reach out, he got back to me. But while I was waiting for his reply, I put out a couple feelers through some genealogy work I did and reading some obituaries and trying to find some Moors, and I found one. And then I found that there was another one, and they were all connected, having a family reunion in Manhattan. And they're all coming in, and it's really fun. And there's about 30 of them coming into town. And then their father, or their grandfather, used to own, he was first mayor of Muttontown out of Long Island. And they had a home called Chelsea House out there, and it's now owned by the Parks. And I phoned the Parks, said, "Can we have a party with you? Because all these Moors are coming up into town." And they went, "Yeah, we never had a party here, let's do it." So we're having a big party out there too. So it's really fun. They just need to stop calling me and asking me where to park in Manhattan and where to eat dinner and where to stay. I'm not a tour guide. And I'm not from Manhattan. But it's funny, this family reunion has really caught on. We're having dinner parties and everything together. So it's all great. So this is the Church of Intercession, which is on tonight in Manhattan. They've done it for over 100 years. Children walk to the grave of Clement Moore. They lay a wreath, and they say Christmas. They say "Twas for Christmas" together. And I think it starts at 4:30 today. But they've done it for 100-something years, so you can go next year, don't worry. Tonight at 6 o'clock at the Chelsea Community Church, St. Peter's Church in Manhattan, Chelsea, which Moore donated the land for the church. They're having a ceremony tonight too, and they are reading up the poem. They usually have a celebrity read the poem. Last year it was Ethan Hawke, I don't know who it is this year. But I was going to go this evening, but I was with Santa and the elves in Times Square this morning, and I think I'm going to be done. I'm going to go to the candlelight service to find a hotel. It was really fun though with all the elves and all these little children this morning. It was great. So I published a book in English, Spanish, and French, and Mandarin. And I have had some success with this over the last 10, 12 years, but it remains an English poem, primarily. And the reason for that is many of these cultures have their own traditions. Like the French have Père Noël, and although they love the poem when they read it, it's not their tradition the way it is like my culture. And I think that it's this legacy of having had heard it as a child, like I did when I was 4, and then having had someone I love read it to me every year until I was old enough to read it to myself, or to read it to my own granddaughter, as I just did. It's that legacy. It's this idea of families gathered around a Christmas tree, families gathered around one time of the year, and they read this poem together. And I think that's why it's so magical, and it's so popular, and it survived 200 years. So the 2 reasons would be there is nobody being threatened with a birchen rod, and there's this wonderful memory, which I certainly have of my father. So I think that this is why it survived. And I always like to mention my cover because this is a really wonderful artist named Helen Chamberlain. I did it for 2 reasons. One, she's not very well known, and I thought she deserved another day in the sun compared to some of Norman Rockwell's and Andy Warhol's, who I could have put on the cover. I just decided to give it to her. And also because in my work, I wasn't looking for it. I was really astounded by the number of women in the arts through the years. And it wasn't just the arts, it was in the literary arts. And I hadn't sort of drawn that, I hadn't sort of understood that as well before. That the Puritans who come here, Mayflower onward, yes, they hated Christmas and they put people in jail or banned Christmas cookies and got kind of hyperbolic about all of this, right, for a very long time. But they had one really, really interesting trait, which was they highly valued learning, and they really believed everybody should know how to read and write. And so they educated their young women, their young girls, their children, both male and female, and elder servants, anybody who worked in the household, because they wanted them to learn the scriptures, but what that gave them was the ability to read. And so you have this wonderful legacy of women writers coming along who've written a lot of great Christmas things, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I discovered all these people as I was working on this. And I also discovered that the first published novelist from America was a woman. And I find that really interesting. So sometimes they didn't put their names to it because, sort of somewhat notorious to have your name in the paper or on something. Like Susan Fenimore Cooper, she didn't put her name on it right away when the first naturalist writers. But they were there working away, and they were certainly, their talent was there, even if they hadn't put their names to it. And that goes to, I always have to mention Sarah Hale, because Sarah Hale was an editor who finalized this concept of Christmas after the Civil War. So you have this, as we've said, this development of Christmas, and where it really goes after the Civil War is that everybody is so tired of war that they want to go home. And they go home to Christmas, and you have major developments that finally make this come true for John Petard, who's long gone by then. But you have the railroads come, and the railroads, compared to stagecoaches, are so important because a railroad can transport newspapers and magazines and books. The newspapers and magazines can influence fashion and style and customs like nothing. And Sarah Hale is a very prominent editor who loves Queen Victoria, and she takes on the Christmas tree and all the other things that she loves, like Thanksgiving. She's the one that wrote to Lincoln 15 times saying, let's do Thanksgiving as a national event. And they say that she was the equivalent of Martha Stewart and Oprah Winfrey in one human being. She was so influential in her day, and she just loved Christmas. And so you finally, after the Civil War, get this absolute, Christmas that everybody really wanted. Christmas trees come into play, Christmas presents, Christmas wrapping paper can be printed in color, and you can transport all the gifts, and you can transport all these newspaper magazines, and beautiful editions of Twas can now be circulating everywhere. So that's really what happens, in my estimation, of what happens at Christmas in America. It takes off after the Civil War, and it just keeps going, and it's really something. So this is my book, and my reindeer, and this is my social media. So I think the best thing to do is for you to ask me questions, because then I can answer what you're really interested in the most with the time that we have together. So here you go. That's a summary of my book. It's a 264-page book, so it gives you a feel for it. So does anyone have a question? Oh, good.
Yes, I have a question. Prior to the emphasis on St. Nick, where was the nativity in the understanding of Christmas?
Well, they went to church on Christmas, and it would have been part of that. So back in the day at Clement Moore, they would have done. But when you read their diaries, Christmas it's just not. They didn't mention it for decades and decades. But they would have gone to church, and it would have been part of the service. But it wouldn't have been. It would have been church and dinner, and no mention of anything else. You can go plowing through diaries looking for it, and no one even mentions it's Christmas Day. It's really fascinating.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. In other cultures possibly, but in Moore's household, that's what it would have been like. Church, once or twice probably that day, and then dinner. But and New Year's was a big thing in New York. George Washington comes to New York and he goes, what's with the New Year's Eve things? And they're really big, right? And they ate St. Nicholas cookies and drank sherry and had a really wild time. And they were still doing 12th night too, by the way. George Washington was married on 12th night, so that was still there too. But any other questions? Yes.
What was your favorite depiction of Santa Claus?
My favorite is Dorothy, the father of American Illustration from 1862, because he has him as a little elf, and he's such a talented artist, self-taught. He did everything. He did Washington Irving, he did Poe, Charles Dickens, everything. So he was very, very, very talented, and he's been forgotten. And his art isn't worth very much anymore, and I think it's really sad because he's super talented. So I don't know if I win those paintings, I probably will. Mm-hmm. Yes?
What is this story about?
It's about giving to other people who need things. That's what it's really about. Generosity spirit.
So first of all, I want to commend you for taking in your speech to bring up current things, like women not getting enough credit for art, even now.
Right.
Early sculptors, stuff like that. You mentioned it. The only thing I see in a lot of your older art that you shared on the presentation, I didn't see Maxwell Parrish anywhere. Yet a lot of the art that you have had similar design.
Right. Well,
And he was a big Clarke.
I'm a big fan of Maxwell Parrish. I actually had this little thing that I do. I go find somebody like Maxwell Parrish and I say, okay, how does he relate to this? And then I'd look and I go, okay. and I found him. And he's in my book. And he illustrated Knickerbocker for Washington Irving, Knickerbocker by Washington Irving, and he does St. Nicholas. And it was like, yay! Like, it was a natural character in my book. Andrew Wyeth is one of my favorite artists. And the Wyeths were crazy about Christmas. N.C. Wyeth would be on the roof. You know, the Santa Claus outfits, we painted Santa Claus in multiple things.
Oh, it wasn't running through the tracks.
Yeah, well, no, he does, N.C. Wyeth does commercial look and fine art on Santa Claus, but he never does Twas. So I was down in Delaware and I was, at Running Wine, and I really got a sense of how much they like Christmas. And I've read some letters from Jamie Wyatt and people too about what Christmas is like in the Wyatt household. But then I thought, Andrew Wyatt, who was, when I was little, I saved up my money to buy an Andrew Wyatt book, right? So I was really in favor of it. And so I went and looked, here's one of my exercises. Christina's World, the open window, red and white stocking on the bedpost. How unbelievable. I couldn't, he tucked it in there. I think it was a nod to his father. There's the Christmas stocking hanging on the open window painting in Christina's World. That's crazy, right?
So you've been living Christmas for the last decade. So every day.
Yeah, a few family weddings thrown in. Yeah, and a new granddaughter. I mean, sure. But the art legacy is, Andy Warhol, right? 1981, the Necessary Santa Claus, it's just crazy. And all of them are Rockwell and Leyendecker. And it's incredible how many artists come to this in some way. And that's funny you mentioned Maxwell Parrish, because I got into grad school doing something with him. So that's what I find so interesting. I used him specifically as an example one day. He also, Maxwell Parrish, there was a man who wrote, started a Christmas campaign to write letters, to help children get their letters to Santa Claus. And he started to raise money to build a Santa Claus museum in downtown Manhattan. And he did it for 14 years, I think it was, a long time. Raised all this money. And then people started to say, well, what are you doing with it? Like, where's, I haven't seen any plans start or anything else. But he had Maxwell Parrish draw these facades, the white marble facade for the Santa Claus Museum. And then he was found out to be a bit of a shyster, and he took off with the money and went to Florida. So we don't have a Santa Claus Museum. But Maxwell Parrish was involved, and I think that there's a whole bunch of really fancy people and architects and people involved in this whole project. So there's a second Maxwell Parrish who I found. He would have been the Santa Claus Museum artist, right? White marble, would have been great. But we don't have that. So. And there was going to be a Santa Claus Museum in Newport, Rhode Island. James Van Allen II, when his mother was the wealthiest woman in Newport at one point, the Gilded Age. I guess his grandmother. Their home is now a university. But he was raising money to do a Santa Claus Museum in Clement Clarke Moore's home, and they fell off a balcony and died. So that was sad. Tragically, we don't have that museum. So, yeah. But, any other questions? Yes.
In the book, do you have the timeline, because the poem was written in 1823.
1822.
Yeah, and then you said that Dickens came out with A Christmas Carol in 1843.
Yes.
And during that time, 1930s, Nash, it's interesting to see the evolution of this as you're relaying, the history. And it's really quite fascinating.
What's fascinating is connectivity. Mark Twain would say that nothing's ever original, there's no plagiarism, because we're all connected and there's no original concept. He changed that later when he wants copyright and money for his children, but anyway, there's this connectivity, and that's what I've always found so intriguing about, people do not work in, especially artists don't work in vacuums. Like Robbie Burns. Robbie Burns says, I heard the New Year's Eve song, I heard it from a man, I wrote it down. It's the oral tradition, but they bring themselves to it, right? That so I think I love that, and especially in art, because you look at Odin, right? And the ravens who, go and seek out to report back to Odin about who's been naughty and nice, and it's really interesting stuff. So it all was tied together in this tapestry, and I sort of view culture as tapestry, and that one can draw threads, but one should not pull threads out, because it also becomes frayed then. And you have to take the whole thing and connect it all. It's sort of how I view it. So, yeah, but, and I think that the fact that Santa Claus is a secular character has done a lot to maintain the poem, and you could have Santa Claus in the school in America under the Establishment Clause without any problem. You actually can have Santa Claus, even if he was a religious character, under the freedom of religious expression, as long as you have another symbol at the same time. So anyone who says you can't have Santa Claus in a public building or in a school is mistaken under the Constitution. So that's sort of an interesting conversation it's another day, but it is going on right now. People sometimes think that we shouldn't have Santa Claus in public buildings, but Jill Biden just proved the point, didn't she?
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. Sure.
Are you tracing it further to see the impact of Frosty the Snowman? I mean, and once the animated stories came to the present day, is that something that, how it's evolved, or you think?
No, really not so much. I just don't think that we'd have the Grinch, we wouldn't have Snoopy's Christmas if we didn't have this poem. So I think they're more derivatives of it, inspired by it. This is the key, this is the centerpiece of it all. It's the most famous poem ever written in English language, the most republished, the most illustrated. Kind of fun.
And excellent, and thank you. I mean,
And the children's book of 1821 was the first lithograph book in America. It was about the cow and the reindeer.
wow.
Kind of fun.
Wonderful.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah.
So, any other questions?
It's sort of off topic, I think,
Okay.
but it kind of piggybacks on Frosty the Snowman. And because Mrs. Claus wasn't included, wasn't even thought of in the original poem,
Right.
when did she come about? Was that more of a commercialized kind of?
No, it's stories. She comes up through stories. She's introduced. It's in my book. I haven't asked it for a little while. I think it's 1840s or 1880s. It's in there. She comes along. Yeah, quite early.
She's always behind the man.
And he has sisters and brothers and twin siblings. And I mean, there's all these different stories that come along to develop Santa Claus. The fact that he's in the North Pole comes before comes Mass, although Mass is often credited with it, but it's 1850, so it's earlier than Mass. Mass doesn't come until 1863. So, and but yeah, it's crazy to think that it's more famous than Shakespeare. So, I mean, it's just loved by everybody. But I think it's so tied into this season and just having it read to you. So I really hope that all of you this Christmas Eve, when it turns 200, I really hope you read it this summer. I think it's a really important poem for children because it speaks to magic and creative thought and hope and belief and just goodness and love and everything else. It's not really complicated, but it's so endearing. And I always think back to Jimmy Cricket on a rock, right, wishing upon a star, or Lana seeing a pumpkin patch waiting for a pumpkin. It's this magical thinking in faith and hope and belief in goodness and I guess it's on all of us to make sure that little kids have what they need in life and have great literature. I'm a huge fan of children's literature. And if this can excite them, I mean, I've heard it said this is the first poem that children learn to recite without being asked to do so. They just do it willingly. And, and lots of little children talk to me and they'll start reciting it. I'll just end, if there's no more questions, but I was out at Newport signing all the mansions, which was really fun last week. And a little girl came up to my table and she said, Dad, can I have this book? And he said, I'm sure parents get asked for everything in every store. And he said, no, we're good. And she came back and she goes, no, I really want this book. And I really like this book. And so he said, okay. So he got the book. And she walked out of the store hugging the book. She walked up the stairs hugging this book up the stairs. And I went, this is so good. I just loved it, right? So what a sweet thing to see, right? Because she'll have it her whole life. But I always tell parents, write your name in the book and say, I bought this for you on this date, and or grandparent, write in it and say, this is from me, and then you'll have that. I have mine from my dad. I'm 65, so got it when I was 4. I had smoking on every single page. I'm not throwing it out. This is about burning books. This is about giving children options. So, anyway,
Don't forget Good Night Movie.
Yes. Yes. No, great book. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.